There's towns that remember what decency looks like. And there's towns that forget. Stillwater, New Mexico territory, summer of 1878. 108 degrees, sun sitting on your shoulders like a man with a grudge. A woman lay in the street beside the watering trough. Dress torn, blood in the dust, bruises dark as storm clouds on her face. Folks walked around her, pretended they didn't see. Shutters closed, doors latched. The Dalton name carries weight in these parts, and weight makes a man look the other way. That's when Colt Avery rode in. He reined in his buckskin gelding 10 feet from where she lay, sat there a moment, looking at that broken girl in that empty street. 52 years old, storm gray eyes, hands scarred from rope and wire, a man who'd learned when to speak and when silence did the work better. Then he climbed down, and the town held its breath. Colt approached slow, the kind of slow a man uses around a spooked horse. Steady, no sudden moves, hands where she could see them. He knelt in the dust 3 feet from where she lay, curled against the trough's shadow. Up close. She was younger than he'd figured. Maybe 24, 25. Dark blonde hair matted with blood and dirt. Green eyes that tracked his every movement like a doe watching for wolves. Her dress, what was left of it, had been nice once, calico print, careful stitching. Now torn at the shoulder, dusty and dark with stains he didn't want to name. Easy now, he said, voice low and even. Nobody's gonna hurt you. She flinched. Tried to push herself up, but something in her ribs made her gasp and sink back down. Her hands scraped at the dirt like she meant to crawl away from his kindness. Colt stayed still. Didn't reach for her, just waited. Behind him, he felt the town watching. Heard a shutter crack open, boots shuffle on boardwalks, the creak of Dutch Magruder's store sign swinging in the hot wind. 50 pairs of eyes and not one voice raised in her defense before he'd ridden in. "I'm just offering a hand, ma'am," Colt said. "You're free to say no." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the price that always came with mercy. She found only weathered patience, the face of a man who'd learned that rushing a wounded thing only made it run. She didn't take his hand, but she stopped trying to crawl away. Colt shrugged off his coat, faded blue cavalry wool, brass buttons dull from years and dust. He'd worn it through the last months of the war, through cold nights and hot marches and more blood than a man ought to carry home. It smelled like leather and horse and wood smoke. He stood, walked 2 steps to her side, and draped the coat over her shoulders. Covered the torn dress, the bruises, the shame men had put on her like a brand. She clutched it with trembling hands, pulled it tight around herself like armor. Then Colt did something that made her breath catch. He turned his back, gave her privacy to sit up, to gather herself. To know he wasn't going to stand there staring while she tried to find some scrap of dignity in the dirt. "Take your time," he said, facing the empty street. "I'll be right here when you're ready." 3 years since a man had looked away instead of looking at her like she was something to be bought, broken, or used up. She sat up slow, ribs screaming, and wrapped the coat tighter. It was too big, swallowed her whole. But it was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the 108-degree heat. Across the street, Dutch Magruder stood on his store porch, one hand on the post, the other resting on his cane. 68 years old, white beard, sharp eyes that had seen men at their worst and their best. He watched Colt's back, watched the girl pull herself up against the trough, and muttered low enough that only God and the sparrows heard. About damn time somebody did. Sheriff Ames stood in his office doorway 20 yards down, hand on his gun belt, jaw tight, sweat running down his temple that had nothing to do with the heat. He wanted to move, wanted to do what Colt was doing. But the Dalton name sat on his chest heavier than his badge, and wanting wasn't the same as doing. The preacher's wife peered through lace curtains. The blacksmith leaned in his shop doorway, hammer still in his hand. The schoolteacher stood frozen on the boardwalk with her basket of eggs. They all watched. None of them moved. Stillwater was deciding what kind of town it was, and Colt Avery was forcing the choice. He turned back when he heard her breathing steady some. She was upright now, sitting against the trough, his coat pulled to her chin, still shaking despite the heat. "Can you ride?" he asked. She shook her head. A lie. He could see it in the way her eyes flicked to his horse, but he let it stand. Some truths a woman needed to keep to herself. "Then I'll walk the horse. You'll come with me now." It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a command either. Just a statement of fact, simple as saying the sun would set or winter would come. He offered his hand again. She looked at it, looked at his face. Her eyes were still wild with fear, still waiting for the catch. But there was something else there too, something small and fragile, trying to crack through years of hard dirt. She took his hand. Her grip was weak, fingers cold despite the heat. He pulled her up gentle, felt her hiss through her teeth when weight hit that broken rib. She swayed, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow, respectful, not possessive. Easy does it. He walked her to his buckskin, lifted her into the saddle with the care a man uses carrying something precious that might shatter. She didn't cry. just sat there, holding the saddle horn white-knuckled, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders like borrowed dignity. Colt took the reins and started walking, leading his horse out of Stillwater on foot, slow and steady. Behind him, the town exhaled, shame and relief mixed together like dust and wind. 3 miles out, when Stillwater's false-fronted buildings were just heat shimmer and memory, she finally spoke. "You don't know what you've done." Colt kept walking, boots steady in the sand. "Reckon I'll find out." The horizon stretched wide and empty, sage and creosote, red rock and blue sky. No shade for miles. But somehow, with that coat around her shoulders and this silent man leading her toward something that might be safety, the heat felt a little less like punishment. The gelding's hooves marked time in the dust, and Grace Henley, though Colt didn't know her name yet, let herself hope, just a little, just enough to keep breathing. The sun was bleeding out across the western hills when they reached Colt's spread. 400 acres of high desert, sage and scrub grass, red rock rising in the distance like the bones of something ancient. The windmill creaked slow, pulling water from deep earth. Doves cooed soft in the barn rafters. His house sat low against the land. Adobe walls the color of clay and old blood, tin roof that sang when the rain came, though rain was a stranger in these parts. Corral held 6 horses that lifted their heads as the buckskin approached, nickering low like they were saying welcome home. Colt helped Grace down, her legs barely held her. He steadied her with one hand on her elbow, waited until she found her balance before letting go. This way. Inside, he lit a kerosene lamp. Warm amber glow pushed back the gathering dark. One main room, fireplace built from riverstone, rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, rope bed in the corner covered by a faded quilt, everything neat but worn. A bachelor's life, lived alone and practical, no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the packed earth floor, no flowers in a jar or photographs on the mantel. Just the shape of a man who'd forgotten what comfort looked like, or maybe never learned. Grace stood in the center of the room, still wrapped in his coat, waiting. For the door to lock. For him to tell her the price. For kindness to show its teeth the way it always did. Colt set a tin cup of water on the table, stepped back 3 paces, didn't ask her name. Didn't ask her story, didn't ask what she owed or where she'd run from. Just gave her water and space. She noticed the second door, closed, simple wooden latch, no lock. Her eyes lingered there. Some instinct wondering if that's where he'd put her. Some cellar or storage room where the walls were close and the air was thin. Colt saw her looking. His voice came out sharper than he meant. "That room's not for use. You'll stay out here." Grace nodded quick. Didn't ask, didn't push. She'd learned years ago that questions only brought answers shaped like fists. He softened some, seeing how she'd pulled into herself. "I'll rig a curtain for you, give you some privacy." He found rope in a trunk, strung it corner to corner across one end of the room. Hung an old wool blanket, brown and scratchy but thick enough to make a wall of sorts, a room within a room. Small mercy, but mercy all the same. "There. That'll do for now?" Grace stared at the makeshift space. Her throat worked like she was trying to swallow words that wouldn't go down. Finally managed 2 of them. "Thank you." Colt just nodded, turned to the fireplace and started building up the coals. He cooked without talking. Beans from a clay pot, cornbread wrapped in cloth, salt pork sliced thin. Simple frontier food, the kind that kept a man working but didn't pretend to be anything more than fuel. Set a plate in front of her. Tin fork, chipped ceramic plate, portions smaller than he'd serve himself. Like he understood her stomach had shrunk around fear. Grace stared at it. Her hand stayed in her lap, trembling so slight a man might miss it if he wasn't paying attention. Colt sat across from her and ate. Didn't look at her directly, didn't rush her. Just the sound of his fork scraping plate, the fire crackling low, the windmill's distant creak through the open window. 10 minutes passed. Grace picked up a piece of cornbread. Her fingers brushed the golden crust still warm. She brought it to her mouth slow, like she was afraid it might bite back. Took the smallest bite. Her eyes closed. First real food in 4 days, maybe longer. The kind of hunger that makes you forget what full feels like. That teaches you to survive on hope and stolen scraps and the dull ache that becomes normal. When she opened her eyes again, there were tears on her cheeks, silent. She didn't wipe them away, just took another small bite. Colt kept eating, pretended not to see. Some grief needed privacy, the way wounds needed air. After, he went to the barn, told her he needed to settle the horses, check the water trough, secure the gate. Really, he just needed to give her space, let her breathe without a man's eyes on her. Grace stood alone in the lamplight. The house was quiet in a way that felt dangerous, like silence before a storm, like the moment before someone's hand comes down. She'd learned not to trust quiet. Quiet meant someone was thinking. Thinking meant planning. Planning meant pain. Her eyes moved over his few possessions, rifle mounted above the door, Bible on a small shelf, spine cracked from reading. Tintype photograph in a simple frame. Older couple, stern-faced, maybe his parents. On the mantel, a small wooden box. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Opened the lid. Inside, $47 in coins and worn bills. A brass pocket watch, ticking soft. A folded letter, edges brown with age. Her fingers hovered over the money. She could take it. Run further. California, maybe, or north to Colorado. He was in the barn. He'd never catch her on foot. By the time he realized, she'd be miles gone. Her hand shook over those bills like a bird deciding whether to trust the offered seed or fly. She closed the box, didn't take a cent. Stood there a moment, breathing hard, wondering why. Why she'd chosen to stay hungry when food was right there. Why his quiet decency felt heavier than any lock. When Colt came back inside, Grace was curled on the floor behind the wool curtain, still wearing his coat. He threw another log on the fire, settled into the chair by the hearth with his Bible open on his knee, though he didn't read, just stared at the words until they blurred. Outside, a coyote called. Long and lonesome, the sound of something hunting in the dark. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, Grace Henley slept without waking every hour. No dreams of hands grabbing, no dreams of doors locking, just the deep black of exhaustion finally given permission to rest. But 30 miles south, in a ranch house that smelled like money and cruelty, Frank Dalton was reading a telegram from Sheriff Ames. Found, Stillwater, rancher named Avery. Frank smiled, set down his whiskey glass, reached for his hat. By morning, he'd be collecting what belonged to him. 3 days passed, like water finding its level. Slow, inevitable, settling into new shapes. Grace's ribs still hurt when she breathed deep, but the sharp glass feeling had dulled to an ache she could work around. The bruises on her face were turning yellow-green, healing in reverse like a storm clearing from dark to light. She moved through this house, careful at first, testing boundaries she couldn't see, waiting for Colt to tell her where she could stand, what she could touch when she'd worn out her welcome. He never did, just went about his work, feeding horses, mending fence, checking water lines, and left her to find her own footing. The morning of the third day, Grace woke before dawn, found Colt already at the table, making coffee. The tin pot rattled soft against the stove's iron top. Smell of grounds and heat filled the small room. He poured 2 cups without asking. Set one across from where he sat. She took the chair, wrapped both hands around the cup, felt the warmth spread through her palms. No trembling now, just steady hands holding steady heat. They sat in silence, comfortable somehow, the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Outside, morning doves called. Soft gray light leaked through the window, turning the desert silver. Dawn in New Mexico looked like hope, trying not to make promises it couldn't keep. Grace drank her coffee, watched steam rise and disappear, finally asked the question she'd been holding 3 days. Why'd you stop? Colt considered, took a long sip before answering. Didn't seem right to keep riding. Most men did. Most men ain't worth the coffee they drink. The ghost of a smile touched her mouth. First time he'd seen anything close to humor in her eyes. You don't know anything about me. Know enough? He set his cup down. You needed help. I had 2 hands and a horse. Grace looked into her coffee like she might find courage at the bottom. They're gonna say I'm a thief. Are you? I took bread from their kitchen. Colt's expression didn't change. That ain't theft. That's hunger. I gave it to a child they kept locked in the cellar. Silence. Not the comfortable kind now. The kind that comes before lightning. Colt set his cup down slow. Tell me. So she did. Told him about the Dalton family in Santa Fe. Wealthy railroad investors, 3-story house. Iron gates with brass fixtures that caught the sun like teeth. How she'd signed on at 16 to employment contract for housework, room and board included. Wages to start after the first year. Only the wages never came. Instead, a debt ledger. Charged for the dress they gave her, the meals she ate, the candles she burned, reading at night. 18% interest compounded monthly. By the time she was 20, she owed $800. Debt slavery, Colt said quiet. Got a name for it now, but it's the same old sin wearing new boots. Grace nodded, kept talking, like a wound finally open enough to drain. The boy, Thomas, 9 years old, son of another employee who'd died in childbirth. The Daltons kept him. Future labor, Frank Dalton called it. Locked in the cellar most days. Fed once if he was lucky, twice if they remembered. Grace would sneak him bread, water, blankets when winter came. Risked everything because leaving a child to starve wasn't something she could live with. Got caught one night, Frank Dalton standing in the kitchen doorway watching her wrap cornbread in cloth. His voice had been soft, dangerous soft. You've stolen from us, Miss Henley. I could have you hanged, or you could work off double your debt. She'd run that night. Took nothing but the dress on her back and the fear in her chest. Left the boy behind. That was the weight she carried, not the running, the staying gone. I failed him, she said, voice breaking. I saved myself and left him in that cellar. Colt was quiet a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had the weight of something lived, not just believed. You didn't fail. You got out so you could get help. That's strategy, not cowardice. Grace looked up. Her eyes were wet but fierce. Then help me get him out, please. Him and the others. There's 3 more girls still under contract. Younger than me. Trapped the same way. Before Colt could answer, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning. Single rider, coming fast. We got company. Sheriff Ames rode up looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. He dismounted stiff, hat in his hands, sweat on his temples despite the cool morning air. Colt, we need to talk. So talk. Privately. Anything you got to say can be said in front of her. Ames sighed, the sound of a weak man who knew he was being weak but couldn't find the spine to stop it. He pulled a paper from his vest. Legal warrant, territorial seal, judge's signature, arrest warrant for Grace Henley. Charges: theft of property valued at $40, breach of employment contract, unlawful flight to avoid debt obligation. He held it out like it might bite him. Issued by Judge Harlan in Santa Fe. I gotta take her in, Colt. You gonna enforce a paper that says a woman owes money for eating? Law's the law. Then the law's a damn liar. The wind picked up. Dust devils spun in the yard. To the south, the sky was turning brown-gray. Storm building, the kind that blotted out the sun and filled your lungs with grit. Colt stepped between Ames and Grace. Not aggressive, just solid. Immovable as Soho stone. She stays. When you're obstructing, I'm standing on my land. She's my guest. You want her, you'll need more than a piece of paper. Ames looked at Grace, looked at Colt, looked at his own hands holding that warrant like it was burning him. Frank Dalton's coming himself, tomorrow, with federal marshals. He mounted up, paused before turning his horse. He ain't gonna be reasonable, Colt. This is gonna cost you. Everything worth doing does. And Ames rode off. Dust from his horse's hooves mixed with the dust from the coming storm, until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Grace stood behind Colt, his blue coat still draped over her shoulders from the morning chill. Her voice came out small but steady. You don't have to do this. Colt didn't turn around, just watched the horizon swallow the sheriff. Already done. The storm was building. By morning, Stillwater would be choosing sides. And a town that had walked past a woman bleeding in the street was about to learn what happened when one man decided walking past wasn't an option anymore. Inside, the coffee had gone cold. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain that would never fall. Neither of them slept that night. Grace sat outside, on the porch step, wrapped in Colt's coat, watching the sky. The dust storm had blown itself out by evening, leaving the air scrubbed clean and cold. Stars thick as spilled salt, so bright they hurt to look at. The kind of night that made a person feel small and seen all at once. Colt came out sometime past midnight. Didn't ask permission, just sat on the step beside her, 3 feet of space between them. Close enough to talk, far enough to let her breathe. Long silence, just the sound of distant wind through sage, an owl calling somewhere in the dark hills. Finally, Grace spoke. You'll lose everything. Had worse losses. Why are you doing this? Colt stared out at the darkness where his fence line disappeared into nothing. When he answered, his voice carried weight he'd been holding too long. Got my reasons. Grace turned to look at him. His face was stone in the starlight, weathered, hard, old before its time, but his eyes held something softer, something broken that never healed right. Tell me. So he did. Had a daughter, Sarah Beth, married her off when she was 19 to a man named Thomas Garrett. Seemed decent enough, worked for the railroad, had prospects, said the right words in front of preachers and parents. Colt's hands gripped his knees, knuckles white in the dark. Year later, she came home with bruises on her arms, said she'd fallen off a horse. He stopped, swallowed. I knew she was lying. I knew, and I let her go back anyway. Grace didn't speak, just listened. Next time it was a black eye, broken finger. Thomas came to fetch her home, and I told her marriage is a vow. Told her you work through hard times. Told her that's what women do. They stand by their men even when standing hurts. His voice cracked on the last word. I told my girl to go back to the man who was killing her. 'Cause that's what a man's supposed to do, right? Keep peace. Don't interfere in another man's house. Mind your own damn business. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote answered the owl. 5 years ago, she ran, made it to El Paso. Started sending me letters, begging me to come get her. Said she was scared. Said Thomas was hunting her. Said, please, Pa, please. He pulled something from his vest pocket. A folded envelope, edges soft from handling. I didn't go. Thought she'd come to her senses. Thought she'd come home on her own when she got tired of running. His laugh was bitter as alkali water. Letters stopped 2 years back. Don't know if she's alive or dead, or halfway between. Grace felt tears on her own cheeks now. That locked room, Colt continued. That's hers. Got her letters pinned to the wall, 73 of them. Read them every night. Every word's a nail in my chest, but I earned every one. He looked at Grace then, really looked at her. So when I see you lying in that street, and I see every man in town walking past, his voice dropped to something raw and honest. I see Sarah Beth, and I see myself. And I stop, because maybe I can't save my daughter. But I can stop being the kind of man who tells wounded women to go back to their wolves. Grace was crying now, silent tears that caught starlight. When she spoke, her voice shook. I'm not the only one. Colt waited. 3 other women still at the Daltons. Younger, 16, 17, 18, Maria, Rebecca, Ada, same contracts, same debt, same cage. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I didn't just run for myself. I ran to get proof, to bring authorities back, to save them. She looked at him, and he saw the truth of her in that moment. Not some helpless thing to be rescued, but a woman fighting in a war she couldn't win alone. I'm not some broken girl you saved, Colt. I'm a woman who failed. I got caught before I could finish what I started. Those girls are still there, still locked up, still being... Her voice broke. I failed them. Colt reached out slow, rested one weathered hand on her shoulder. Just steady weight, no pressure. You didn't fail. You're still here, still fighting. His grip tightened just enough to matter. And now you ain't fighting alone. Grace looked up at him. Your daughter, you think she'd forgive you? Don't matter. I don't forgive myself. Those girls back at the Daltons, I don't forgive myself either. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and beautiful and cruel. Colt spoke into the darkness, voice quiet but solid as bedrock. Maybe we don't get forgiveness. Maybe we just get one more chance to do right. Is that enough? Has to be. They sat there until the stars started fading into dawn, 2 people carrying different ghosts that weighed the same. When the first gray light touched the eastern hills, Colt stood, offered Grace his hand. Come on. He led her inside, walked to the locked door, the one he'd warned her away from 3 days ago, put his hand on the latch, hesitated, then opened it. The room was small, bed still made with a faded quilt, dresser with a hairbrush on top, and the walls covered with letters, dozens of them, pinned like pressed flowers in a dead garden. Sarah Beth's handwriting, desperate and young and fading. Grace stood in the doorway, seeing his guilt made visible. We saved those girls, Colt said. Not a question, a vow. All of them, the boy too. Grace nodded, found her voice. All of them. Outside, hoofbeats. Multiple riders this time, moving fast through the pre-dawn gray. Frank Dalton had arrived, and the reckoning was at hand. Dawn came dirty. The dust storm Frank Dalton brought with him wasn't weather. It was 3 riders and the weight of money behind them. Frank sat his horse like a man born to saddle but raised in parlors. Expensive suit, charcoal gray, tailored tight, thin mustache, cold blue eyes that calculated cost before they saw people. Flanking him, 2 federal marshals, badges catching what little light broke through the brown-gray sky, rifles across their saddles. Not threatening, just there. Colt stood in his yard, Grace behind him in the doorway, still wearing his coat, hands gripped white on the frame. Mr. Avery. Frank's voice was smooth. Educated back east somewhere, words shaped careful to sound reasonable. I'm Frank Dalton. I believe you're harboring my employee. She's my guest. Miss Henley has obligations. And he pulled papers from his saddlebag, thick sheaf, official seals, territorial stamps, held them up like scripture. Legal contract signed, notarized. She agreed to work for my family in exchange for wages, room, and board. You mean she signed at 16 when she couldn't read proper, and you've been bleeding her ever since? Frank smiled, thin, cold as January water. I understand frontier sentiment, Mr. Avery. But this is civilization. We have courts, contracts, law. Without them, we're no different than savages. He showed the contract closer. Grace's signature, shaky, childish. The debt ledger beneath it, numbers growing like infection. She owes $1,200. The territorial court agrees. Judge Harlan has ruled in our favor. Behind Colt, Grace made a sound like something dying quiet. Frank's smile widened. I'm offering mercy. She returns, works 5 more years, debt forgiven. Otherwise, he gestured to the marshals. Otherwise, the law takes its course. Colt's jaw set like stone. She's not going. Mr. Avery, you heard me. Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He reached into his vest, pulled out a second document. This one folded, sealed with wax. I was hoping to resolve this quietly, but since you're being difficult... He opened it slow, deliberate. "The town deserves to know what kind of woman you're protecting." And Sheriff Ames rode up then, late, sweating, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Frank handed him the paper. "Read it, Sheriff." Ames's face went pale. He looked at Grace, at Colt, back to the paper. "Out loud, please." Ames cleared his throat, voice shaking. Death certificate, Martin Reeves, overseer, Dalton Ranch, died March 14, 1878, cause fall down cellar stairs, neck broken. Silence, except for the wind tearing at everything. Frank's voice cut through. "Miss Henley fled that same night. My overseer dead. Her gone. The connection is apparent." Grace's legs buckled. She caught herself on the doorframe, knuckles bone white. Colt turned his head just enough to see her. "That true?" She couldn't speak, just nodded. Frank gathered his reins. "I've called a town meeting, noon, Community Hall. The people of Stillwater deserve to know the truth about the woman you're sheltering." He looked at Grace directly. "About the murderer sleeping under your roof." He wheeled his horse. The marshals followed. Sheriff Ames stayed behind, miserable. "I'm sorry, Colt, but if she killed a man, get off my land." Ames rode away. The wind howled. Dust filled the air until you couldn't see 10 yards. The world shrinking down to just this moment, this choice, this unbearable weight. Inside, the lamp flickered. Grace stood against the wall, shaking so hard her teeth chattered despite the coat wrapped tight around her. "I killed him." Voice barely a whisper. "I killed Martin Reeves." Colt closed the door against the dust. Stood there, waiting, not judging yet, just listening. "Tell me what happened, all of it." And so Grace told him. Martin Reeves, Frank's ranch overseer. 43 years old, face like sun-dried meat, hands that left bruises. He'd watched Grace for months with wrong kind of eyes, the way a man looks at property he means to use. One night, Frank was in Santa Fe on business. His wife asleep upstairs. House quiet, except for Grace in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. Martin came in. Shouldn't have been there. His quarters were above the barn. But he came in anyway, boots loud on the tile, smelling like whiskey and intent. "Mr. Dalton won't mind what I do with hired goods." Grace tried to leave. He blocked the door, grabbed her, shoved her against the table. Hand over her mouth, other hand tearing at her dress. She couldn't scream. Couldn't breathe. Could only fight, clawed his face, kneed him hard enough to make him stagger back. He came at her again, cursing, blood from the scratches running down his cheek. The cellar door was behind him, open. 14 stone steps down to where they kept the boy locked up. Grace pushed, hard as she could, desperation giving her strength she didn't know she had. Martin stumbled backward, tried to catch himself, didn't. Fell, 14 steps, stone floor. Neck broke on impact. Grace was crying now, years of held-back grief pouring out like blood from a reopened wound. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him off me. I just wanted to breathe." Her voice cracked. "But he's dead, and I did it. Christian woman's not supposed to take a life, not even—" "Stop." Colt's voice cut through. Quiet, but absolute. He crossed the room, stood in front of her. Not touching, just close enough that she had to look at him. "You didn't murder anyone. You defended yourself." "But I killed." "Man tries to force himself on a woman? That's the murder. What you did was survival." Grace shook her head, tears streaming. "The law says—" "Law's wrong. Been wrong before, will be wrong again. Don't make it right." He waited until she looked up at him, his storm-gray eyes steady as bedrock. Dalton covered it up because he knew it, knew what Reeves tried to do, knew if word got out, his railroad investors might ask questions about how he treats his employees. So he turned your defense into his weapon, made you carry the guilt for saving your own life. But Grace's breath came in gasps. "The town's gonna believe him. They'll think. Don't matter what they think. Matters what's true." She looked at him. This weathered rancher who'd stopped for her in the street, who'd given her his coat, who'd opened his daughter's shrine to share his own guilt, who stood there now telling her the things she'd needed to hear for months. "You didn't deserve what happened to you. You gonna stand with me at that meeting?" Her voice small, but not quite broken. Every step. By 11, the whole town knew. Word spreads fast in places where everybody knows everybody's business. Grace Henley, the woman Colt Avery took in, wasn't just a runaway, she was a killer. Shopkeepers whispered behind hands. Mothers pulled children off the street. The preacher's wife clutched her Bible tighter. Even Dutch Magruder stood quiet on his porch, watching the dust blow through town, thinking hard about what side of history he wanted to stand on. Only the wind moved without judgment, just tearing at everything, filling the air with grit, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. At noon, the community hall was packed. Frank Dalton stood at the front like a prosecuting attorney. Federal marshals flanking him, rifles held casual but ready. Sheriff Ames by the door, hand on his gun belt, face gray with the weight of what he'd become. Every chair filled, Standing room only. Stillwater had come to judge. Colt and Grace walked in together. Every head turned, and the silence was a living thing, thick and heavy and waiting to see which way it would break. Grace stood there in Colt's blue coat, bruises still yellow-green on her face, hands steady now 'cause terror had burned through to something harder. She'd spent 3 years running, but running was done. Whatever came next, she'd face it standing. The dust storm rattled the windows. The lamp flames guttered, and Frank Dalton smiled like a man who'd already won. Frank Dalton stood at the front of the hall like he owned it. Maybe he did. His father's money had built half of Stillwater, after all. The territorial judge was in his pocket. The law wore his name like a brand. He held up the papers. Let everyone see the seals, the signatures, the weight of civilization. Good people of Stillwater, his voice carried. Educated, reasonable. The kind of voice that made cruelty sound like commerce. I come to you not as an outsider, but as a fellow citizen of this territory, a man who believes in law, order, and the bonds that hold civilized society together. He paced slow, like a lawyer working a jury. The law is our foundation. Without it, we're no different than the savages we displaced. We have contracts, courts, justice. He pointed at Grace without looking at her. This woman signed a legal agreement. She accepted employment, room, board, training. She accrued debt, as people do when they consume more than they produce. That's not cruelty. That's arithmetic. A few heads nodded. The shopkeeper shifted in his seat. The rancher in the back crossed his arms, listening. She agreed to work off her debt. That's civilized commerce. That's how society functions. Frank's voice hardened just enough. Instead, she stole from us $40 in goods. Then she assaulted and killed a good man, my overseer Martin Reeves. A man with a wife and children depending on him. Gasps, whispers. Grace felt them like blows. Then she fled, like a coward, like a criminal. He pulled out the death certificate again, held it high. I showed mercy, called it an accidental fall because I believed in redemption. But I won't show mercy to theft, to flight, to violation of lawful contract. He set the papers on the table in front of him. Contract, debt ledger, warrant, death certificate. The accumulated weight of law, made paper. I ask only that you honor what we've built together. Respect for property, respect for law, respect for the agreements that separate us from chaos. He looked around the room, made eye contact with the mayor, the banker, the land office clerk. Return her to my custody. Let the territorial court decide her fate. That's all I ask. Justice. According to law. The room was silent. Frank sat down, looked satisfied. Sheriff Ames stepped forward, reluctant, face pale. Frank's papers are in order. His voice sounded hollow. Judge Harlan signed the warrant. I got no legal ground to refuse. He looked at Colt, something apologetic in his eyes, something dying. Ma'am, you'll need to come with us. Grace stood. She was shaking, not from fear now, but from rage at how easy it was. How men in nice suits could turn survival into crime, self-defense into murder, desperation into debt. She started to remove Colt's coat, to give it back before they took her. Colt's hand stopped her. Gentle but firm. Keep it. Their eyes met. He nodded once. Some understanding passing between them that needed no words. Grace nodded back. Started toward the marshals. Hold on. Dutch Magruder's voice from the back. Rough as creek gravel. Old. Every head turned. He stood slow, leaning heavy on his cane. Walked down the center aisle like a man who'd seen enough years that fear didn't move him much anymore. Stopped in front of Frank Dalton. I'm 68 years old, fought in 2 wars, lost 3 fingers to frostbite and my left knee to a Comanche arrow, seen men at their worst and their best. He tapped Frank's papers with his cane. And I know the difference between law and justice. Frank's jaw tightened. Mr. Magruder, your sentiment is touching but irrelevant. The law also says a man can't force himself on a woman. Dutch's voice cut sharp. But your overseer tried. And you covered it up to protect your reputation. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising like wind before rain. You have no proof. Got Grace's word, and Colt's witness to her character. Dutch looked around the room. That's proof enough for me. The blacksmith stood. Big man, arms like fence posts from 20 years working iron. Dutch is right. Something ain't square here. The preacher stood next, white collar catching lamplight. The Lord says, let justice roll down like waters. His voice trembled but held. Not just law, justice. But half the room stayed seated. The shopkeeper looked at his hands. We can't go against a territorial judge. Dalton's got influence. All of them's. The rancher in back. They'll make life hard for us. Bank loans, shipping rates. They got leverage. The banker didn't stand. The mayor didn't stand. The land office clerk studied his boots. Fear. Plain and simple. The kind that makes good men complicit. Frank smiled, saw the room divided. Knew divided meant he'd won. You see? Even your own people understand. This is law, not sentiment. Sheriff, do your duty. Ames stepped forward, put his hand on Grace's arm. Not rough, but not gentle either. Just the touch of a man doing what he was told because he didn't have the spine to do what was right. Grace closed her eyes. Behind her, the few who'd stood looked at the floor. Dutch gripped his cane hard enough the wood creaked. The blacksmith's fists clenched. The preacher's lips moved in silent prayer. But standing wasn't enough when the law had guns and papers and judges in pockets. Frank gestured to the marshals. Take her. They moved forward, slow, professional. No malice, just duty. Grace felt Ames's grip tighten on her arm. The door seemed 100 miles away. And then a chair scraped. Colt Avery stood. The sound cut through the room like a rifle shot. Every eye turned to him. He didn't move from where he stood, didn't draw a weapon, didn't raise his voice. Just spoke one word. No. The word hung in the dusty air, simple, absolute, the kind of no that didn't negotiate. Frank's smile faded. The marshals stopped. Sheriff Ames's hand loosened on Grace's arm, and the whole town held its breath. Because sometimes one man saying no is louder than 100 men saying nothing, the dust swirled outside, the lamps flickered, and Stillwater stood on the edge of a choice it couldn't unmake. Colt stepped between Grace and the marshals. Not aggressive, just solid. Immovable as stone worn smooth by 1,000 years of water. She's not going. Frank's face flushed. Mr. Avery, you're obstructing federal officers. I'm invoking territorial homestead protection. She's resident on my land, under my roof, by my invitation. You want her, you go through me. The room shifted. People leaning forward now, watching. Frank stood, drew himself up. You can't, and here's my offer, Dalton. Colt's voice carried, calm, steady. The voice of a man who'd made his choice and wouldn't be moved from it. I'll pay her debt. The crowd gasped. Frank's eyes narrowed. $1,200. You don't have that kind of. I'll mortgage my ranch. 400 acres. Clear title. Bank will loan me $1,500 against it. Colt didn't blink. You get your money. She goes free. Contract void. Grace's whisper cut through. No, Colt, no. Not your land. He didn't look at her. My choice. Frank smiled. Cold and thin as a knife edge. Touching, truly, but she still killed a man, Mr. Avery. Murder doesn't wash away with money. He gestured to the marshals. She's going to Santa Fe for trial. Judge Harlan will hear the case. His smile widened, and we both know how that'll end. The door opened. A man stepped in. Dusty suit, saddlebags over his shoulder, glasses catching lamplight. Maybe 40, lean, with the tired eyes of someone who'd ridden hard and fast. Excuse me, Mr. Dalton. Frank turned. Who the hell are you? Samuel Porter, attorney at law, Albuquerque. He walked to the front, boots loud on wooden floor. Before you take anyone anywhere, the territorial court needs to review this. He handed Sheriff Ames a document. Official stamps. Territorial seal. Ames read it, his face changed. Hope flickering like a candle someone forgot to snuff out. Frank snatched it from him. Read fast. His face went red. This is Territorial Supreme Court ruling, 1875, Martinez Vel. Consolidated Rail Company. Porter's voice was dry, professional. The sound of law without the weight of money behind it. Employment contracts signed by minors without parental or judicial oversight are voidable upon demonstration of coercion or inequitable terms. He pulled more papers from his bag. Miss Henley was 16, illiterate at the time of signing, no guardian present. Debt accrued at 18% annual interest. Rate exceeds territorial usury statute by 4 points. Porter set the papers on the table beside Frank's documents, side by side, law against law. Contract is void, Mr. Dalton. Has been since the day it was signed. The room erupted, voices rising, people standing, the careful silence fracturing into noise. Frank's voice cut through. Judge Harlan already ruled. Judge Harlan doesn't have final authority. Territorial Supreme Court does. Porter pushed his glasses up. I filed an appeal this morning, sent via telegraph to the Capitol. Takes legal precedence over any district ruling. Frank looked like a man watching his house burn. And regarding Martin Reeves's death, Porter pulled out another paper, unfolded it slow. Affidavit from Dr. Edwin Moss, Santa Fe. He examined Reeves's body, noted defensive wounds on Reeves's face and arms. Scratches, bruising consistent with a struggle. He looked at Grace, something gentle in his tired eyes. Also noted Miss Henley's injuries that same night, bruised throat, torn dress, trauma consistent with violent assault. The room went dead quiet. Dr. Moss's report was suppressed by your family, Mr. Dalton, but he's willing to testify, under oath, before a jury. Porter's voice hardened. This was self-defense, and you covered it up. The crowd turned. staring at Frank now, not with fear, with something darker. The look people get when they realize they've been lied to. Dutch Magruder's voice rang out. He covered it up. That girl was defending herself and he called her a murderer? The blacksmith. Son of a bitch. The preacher's wife. Lord have mercy. Colt moved then, calm, deliberate, walked to where Grace stood and removed his blue cavalry coat from around her shoulders. For a moment she looked afraid, like he was taking back his protection. Then he draped it over her shoulders again, carefully, deliberately, making sure everyone in the room saw. Turned to face the crowd. Any man here who believes in doing right, stand with me. Silence. Stretched. Long enough to hurt. Then Dutch Magruder reached into the bag he'd brought, pulled out his old cavalry coat, blue wool, faded, brass buttons dull, walked to stand beside Colt. I stand with Colt Avery. The blacksmith stood, reached behind his forge apron, pulled out his old army jacket, walked forward, stood on Colt's other side. I stand for what's right. The preacher had no coat, just his white collar and his convictions, but he stood anyway. I stand for justice. One by one they came, 7 men, then 10, then 15. Old soldiers mostly, men who'd worn blue or gray, and learned that honor wasn't about which side you fought on, but what you fought. For they formed a wall around Grace, blue coats and gray, brass buttons and worn wool. Old men who remembered when a woman needing protection got it. No questions, no price. The school teacher stood, no coat, but stood anyway. I stand for truth, the banker's wife, the storekeeper's daughter, the widow who ran the boarding house. A wall of witness, bodies and courage. Old and young, men and women all saying the same thing without words. Not here, not in our town, not anymore. Sheriff Ames looked at that wall, looked at his own hands, finally stepped back from Grace. Frank, you need to leave. His hand moved to his gun, not drawing, just ready. Now! Frank saw he'd lost, saw it, in the wall of old coats, old honor, old faith in something he couldn't buy or bribe or break. This isn't over. My father, Porter interrupted. Your father can appeal to the Supreme Court. He'll lose. His voice went cold. And if Miss Henley chooses to file charges for false imprisonment, coerced labor, and obstruction of justice, that's 10 to 20 years territorial prison. Frank's face twisted. What about the others? The 3 girls still under contract. Grace stepped forward then, out from behind the wall of witnesses, voice steady now, clear. They're coming with me, today. She looked at Frank dead on, no flinching, no fear. I didn't run to save myself. I ran to get help. Now I've got it. Colt stepped beside her. We ride to Santa Fe tomorrow. Federal marshal escorts us. We bring those girls home. Porter nodded. I'll file the paperwork. Same precedent applies. Their contracts are void. Frank stared at Grace, at Colt, at the wall of townspeople who'd found their spines. You've made an enemy today. Dutch Magruder laughed, rough and real. Son, we made a choice. There's a difference. Frank turned, walked to the door. The marshals followed. They'd read the room, knew which side the law really stood on when push came to judgment. At the threshold, Frank stopped, looked back. Those girls won't thank you. They got nowhere to go, no skills, no future. Grace's voice stopped him cold. They'll have choice. That's more future than you ever gave them. And he left, door slamming behind him, sound like thunder, and then rain, soft at first, drops hitting the tin roof like whispered forgiveness, then harder. The smell of water on dust, that rare clean smell that only comes when the desert finally gets to drink. People laughed, cried, hugged. The release of tension so strong it made them foolish with relief. Grace stood in the center, Colt's coat around her shoulders, surrounded by community. Dutch stepped forward, took her hand. Welcome to Stillwater, Miss Henley. Asked the preacher. The Lord's justice rolls down like water. The schoolteacher, you're safe now. But Grace knew better. Safe wasn't the point. Free was. And tomorrow, 3 more women would learn what free felt like. 3 days to Santa Fe. Long days in the saddle, cool nights under stars that remembered when this land belonged to no one and everyone. Colt, Grace, Dutch, Sheriff Ames, redeemed now riding to make right what he'd been too weak to stop. Samuel Porter, with his saddlebags full of writs and precedents. 2 federal marshals who'd read the Stillwater meeting for what it was and decided they'd rather escort justice than oppose it. Grace rode her own horse now. A bay mare from Colt's string, steady and sure-footed. She sat the saddle like she'd been born to it, back straight, hands light on the reins. Not the broken girl he'd lifted onto his buckskin 3 weeks ago. She'd stopped lying about what she could do. First night, they camped in the foothills. Colt built the fire while Grace unpacked the food Dutch's wife had sent. Cornbread wrapped in cloth, dried beef, apples from someone's carefully tended tree. After they ate, Colt pulled his rifle from its scabbard, handed it to Grace. You know how to shoot? Some. Show me. He set up a target, tin can on a rock 50 yards out. Stepped back. Grace lifted the rifle, sighted down the barrel, breathed out slow and squeezed. The can jumped, clean hit. Colt nodded. Good, but you're dropping your shoulder. Try again. They spent an hour in the fading light, him teaching, her learning, not because he thought she'd need to fight, but because a woman who could protect herself was a woman who'd never be property again. Dutch watched from the fire, smiled into his coffee. You're a good man, Colt Avery. Colt didn't answer, just showed Grace how to reload faster. Second day, Grace asked the question she'd been holding. What if they don't want to come? The girls. What if they're too scared? They were riding through high desert, sage and red rock, sky so blue it hurt. Colt considered. Then we leave them the choice and ride away, but we give them the choice. That's what matters. And if Dalton fights? Then Porter's got federal marshals and I've got a Winchester. We'll manage. Grace was quiet a moment. Then, thank you. For what? For not telling me I'm foolish. For not saying 3 girls aren't worth the risk. Colt looked at her, storm gray eyes steady. They're worth it. You knew it when you ran. I'm just slow catching up. That night, Grace didn't dream of chains. She dreamed of open doors. Santa Fe rose from the desert like ambition made stone. 3-story buildings, church bells, the smell of money and politics and deals made in back rooms. The Dalton estate sat on the north side, massive ranch house behind iron gates with brass fixtures that caught the autumn sun like teeth. Harrison Dalton met them at the door, older than Frank, 60-some, with the cold eyes of a man who'd spent his life turning people into numbers on ledgers. Mr. Avery, I heard about the unpleasantness. Porter stepped forward. We're here to inspect employment contracts and interview your staff. Federal authority. He showed the writ. The marshals stood close, hands near their guns. Harrison's jaw tightened. But he was smart enough to know when he'd lost. This way. The girls were in the servant quarters. Small room, 3 narrow beds, 1 small window. They looked up when the door opened, eyes wide, scared, like animals that had learned every door brought pain. Maria, 18, Mexican heritage, dark hair in a braid, hands red from lye soap. Rebecca, 17, pale and thin, freckles across her nose, fingers scarred from sewing. Ada, 16, Navajo, black hair cut short, bruise on her cheek that was maybe 2 days old. Grace knelt in front of them, took Maria's hands. Remember me? Maria's eyes filled. You came back. I kept my promise. Grace's voice broke. You're leaving with us. Today. Rebecca shook her head. But the contracts, we owe... Porter stepped forward. Your contracts are void. You owe nothing. Ada looked at the marshal's badge, at the guns, at Grace kneeling there with tears on her face. This ain't a trick? No trick, Colt said from the doorway. You're free. Right now, this moment. Grace asked about the boy, Thomas, the 9-year-old who'd been locked in the cellar. Harrison's face tightened. The child was placed in St. Vincent's orphanage last month. Grace didn't believe him, went to the cellar anyway, found it empty, except for chains on the wall and the ghost of small suffering. But Porter made notes. We'll find him, file charges for endangerment. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The ride back was different. 6 riders now. The 3 girls exhausted, silent, holding onto their horses like they were holding onto hope that might still break. Grace rode beside them, gave them water when they needed it, shared Colt's coat when the nights got cold, told them it was real, over and over, until they started to believe. Ada asked, why did you come back for us? Grace looked at her, 16 years old with eyes that had seen too much. Because someone came for me, and that's how it's supposed to work. The third day, Maria found her voice. What happens to us now? We got no family, no money. Grace looked at Colt. He nodded. Stillwater needs a seamstress, Grace said. Needs help at the general store. Needs someone to teach the younger children their letters. She smiled. Small, but real. You'll work if you want, for wages, real wages. You'll have rooms. You'll have choice. And Rebecca started crying. Not sad tears. The kind that come when you've been holding your breath for years and finally remember how to breathe. They rode into Stillwater at dusk. Autumn light turning everything amber and gold. The whole town was waiting. News had come by telegraph. Dutch's wife had prepared rooms above the store. The preacher's wife brought blankets. The schoolteacher had soup on the stove. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded explanations, just opened doors and said welcome. Grace stood in the street, watching the girls be gathered up by community, watched them flinch at kindness, then slowly, carefully accept it. Dutch walked over, stood beside her. You done good, girl. We're not finished. Still got to find the boy. Still got others trapped in contracts across the territory. one battle at a time. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. Tonight, you rest. Grace took the cup, warm in her hands. She looked for Colt, found him by his horse, checking the saddle one more time, even though it didn't need checking. She walked over, held out the cup. Coffee? He took it, drank, handed it back. They stood there in the amber light, passing one cup between them, and didn't need to say a word about what they'd done or what it meant. Some things don't need saying. 2 weeks after the Santa Fe rescue, Stillwater settled into a rhythm it hadn't known before. Not louder, just better, like a wheel that had been grinding wrong finally found its groove. Grace woke before dawn out of habit, found Colt already in the kitchen, but this time she beat him to the coffee. Had 2 cups poured when he walked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He stopped, looked at the cups, looked at her. You're up early. Learned from a stubborn rancher? Colt almost smiled. Stubborn, huh? Patient. I meant patient. They sat, drank in comfortable silence. The tin cups warm in their hands, steam rising in the cool morning air. Outside, the windmill creaked its steady song. After a while, Colt spoke. Coffee's good? You taught me. Didn't teach you to make it better than mine. Grace did smile then. Small thing, but real. It was the closest they'd come to humor in 3 weeks. Felt good. Like a muscle remembering how to work after being cramped too long. The 3 girls were finding their footing. Slow, careful, like foals learning to trust their legs. Maria took to Dutch's store like she'd been born for commerce. Had a head for numbers, memory for inventory, way with customers that made even the grumpy ranchers soften. Dutch taught her the ledgers, showed her how to order stock, negotiate with suppliers, run a business that depended on trust more than money. End of her first week, he paid her. 75 cents for 6 days' work? Maria stared at the coins in her palm like they were made of starlight. This is mine? Earned it, didn't you? She spent her first dollar on fabric, blue calico, pattern of tiny flowers, made herself a dress that fit right. Not too big, not borrowed, not marked with someone else's ownership. Wore it to church that Sunday, held her head high. Rebecca helped the school teacher with the younger children. Turned out, she had patience for the ones who couldn't sit still, the ones who mixed up their letters, the ones everyone else had given up on. One afternoon, a 6-year-old boy asked, "Why do you look so sad?" Rebecca knelt down, looked him in the eye. I'm not sad anymore. I'm just remembering what sad felt like. So I know how far I've come. The boy thought about that, nodded like it made sense. That night, the school teacher offered Rebecca a permanent position. $2 a week plus room. Rebecca cried when she accepted, but good tears, the kind that mean yes. Ada struggled most. 16 years old Navajo, in a town that didn't always remember how to see past skin color to soul. Some folks crossed the street when they saw her. Some doors stayed closed, but others opened. Grace sat with her one evening on Colt's porch. Ada was quiet, staring at the horizon like it held answers. I don't belong here. Where do you belong? With my people, but I don't know where they are. Reservation school took me 4 years ago. Don't even know if my family's still alive. Grace was quiet a moment. Then, we'll find them. That's what free means, going home. Ada looked at her. You'd help me? That's what we do now. We help each other find home. Dutch had already started asking around, sending letters. Someone who knew which reservation, which family, which girl went missing in '74. It would take time, but time was something Ada finally had. Sunday, the whole town gathered for a harvest meal. Long tables set up in the community square, everyone bringing what they had. Venison, cornbread, beans, and apple smalled, even fruit Dutch's wife had been hoarding since September. Grace brought her cornbread, Colt's recipe, the one he'd fed her that first night. Dutch took a bite, nodded slow. Finest I've had. It was a lie, but it was a kind lie. The kind that said, you're one of us now. That evening, Grace found Colt on the porch, stood beside him, watching the sun bleed out across the western hills. I've been thinking. Dangerous habit. She almost laughed. I should find work in town, get my own place. Colt was quiet. She rushed to fill it. Not because I want to leave. Just, I don't want to owe you my whole life. You don't owe me anything. Never did. I know. She looked at him. That's why I want to stay. Not because I have to, because I choose to. She took a breath. If you'll have me as a ranch hand, paid, $1 a day room and board. Colt considered. Long moment of Western silence. The kind that holds more than words. $1 a day, you get Sundays off? He paused. And you use the front door, not the back. Grace smiled, real and full and reaching her eyes for the first time since he'd known her. Deal. They shook hands. His grip firm, hers steady, not a rescue, not a debt, just 2 people choosing to work the same land and trust each other to pull their weight. Partnership. Plain and simple. Inside, The lamp flickered. Outside, the first stars appeared. Autumn wind carried the smell of harvest and wood smoke, and the promise of winter eventually coming. But not yet. For now, there was work to do, fences to mend, horses to tend. And in the morning, Grace had one more thing she needed to do, something that grew instead of broke, something that stayed. Dawn came soft the morning after their handshake. Grace walked to the plot of land behind Colt's house. Unused ground, weedy and hard-packed. She carried seeds from Dutch's store, her first purchase, with her first week's wages. Tomatoes, beans, squash, a spade. A bucket of water, knelt in the dirt, tested the soil with her fingers. Dry, hard, like everything in this territory that learned to survive without mercy. She began to dig. Colt came out with his coffee, stood on the porch, watching, didn't offer to help. Understood this was hers to do. Grace saw him, nodded once, he nodded back, then just stood there, bearing witness the way a man does when something matters. She worked slow, turned the earth, broke the crust, made rows. Her hands, scarred from years of other people's labor, now choosing their own work. Planting instead of serving, building instead of breaking. Buried the seeds careful, covered them with soil, poured water from the bucket, watched it disappear into thirsty ground. Patted the earth down, tender, like tucking something precious into bed. The morning light warmed her face. Morning doves called soft from somewhere. The windmill creaked its patient rhythm. She stood, brushed dirt from her hands, looked at the small plot. Nothing visible yet, just dark earth and faith. Behind her, Colt's ranch, solid and safe. Before her, horizon, vast and open. Both were hers now. Not by force, by choice. She smiled to herself, private and small and real, walked back toward the house.